Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations number 37. I'm your host, Joe Hannon, Joe from Jersey, Joe the Grappler, who is 6 days away from making his Master Worlds debut and feeling all sorts of feelings about that debut. It's a hell of a thing to get your black belt 4 weeks ago and then be walking into the arena as a brand new black belt at arguably the highest level of competition someone like me can encounter. It's a hell of a thing, too, to see the caliber of people who are now playing in the Masters division. People like Josh Hinger, for example. Really glad that I'm not a middleweight fighting at Masters 3. But hey, you can't account for the fact that I might run into somebody of Josh Hinger's caliber in my bracket. And that's the way Masters has evolved. It used to be this kind of thing where it was more of an amateur affair, and now it's more of a pro amateur affair. And I'm not one to sit and focus too much mental bandwidth on fairness, because ultimately I think it's an irrelevant conversation. But I've certainly heard a lot of talk lately about the fairness of people like that competing in the Masters division. And the way I kind of look at it through a stoic lens is this is not a situation that I really have any power over. So I'm going to fight my best fight against whatever opponent I have to face or opponents I have to face if things go the way I want them to. But, as part of all the feelings that arise in prepping for any competition, particularly one of this caliber, whether that's fear, anxiety, eagerness, anxiousness, excitability, all of these things, I think, in the past are feelings that I've tried to suppress, maybe. I've tried to pull various technical levers to make them go away or to diminish their potency in one way or another, whether that's meditation, which reminds me I haven't meditated this morning. I should really do that. Whether that's meditation or breath work, some combination of both, or time out in nature or body work. There are all these things we can do to kind of reset and try and tamp down the physiological response. But something that I've come to realize is that in doing that, it's a lot like trying to push, like imagine a beach ball, a huge beach ball, like floating in a pool, right? And the beach ball is a symbol of the negative emotions that I just described. And it's an interesting idea, negative emotions rather than just emotions, right? But the beach ball is representative of the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts, right? Thoughts too factor into this, like, oh, how can I win against people who are this good? Or if I really do X, Y, or Z, I think I can make this happen. Or what if this happens? What am I going to do? These thoughts and feelings, we can kind of look at them as not real, right? They're just sort of artifacts of the human experience. But in truth, they're just as real as real life events, like, because they're prompting the same response. The physiological response is no different. And what's interesting to observe is in trying to suppress that physiological response or in trying to suppress the thought storm, you're just trying to push that beach ball underwater. And every time you push it underwater, it surfaces back up. And every time you repeat that act, it kind of creates more waves, more turbulence in the pool. So mentally, my training for this camp, especially after my last competition, has just, instead of trying to push the ball under the surface of the pool, has kind of just been about observing it, kind of letting it do its thing, acknowledging that this is just as real. Me thinking about fighting, visualizing it, or worrying about it, it's just as real as actually doing it. So why try and call it anything else? Why try and push that beach ball under the surface of the water? And, I don't want to say, it's hard to attribute success to something like that, because what is success? We've certainly had meditations on this podcast about that. But it is interesting to observe the qualitative difference in my experience when I do stuff like that. So something you could play around with, perhaps, if you're getting ready to compete, or even just if you have anxiety about walking onto the mats in general. But the other kind of big thing I've been thinking about as I prepare for this competition is something that Josh Waitzkin has talked about. I don't know if he's talked about it publicly or if he's just talked about it in our work together, but it's this idea of transitioning from pre-conscious to post-conscious competitor. Emily Kwok wrote a brilliant essay about this, which I'll share in the show notes, about her experience returning to competition at Masters, actually. after a long hiatus of having children and stuff like that. The idea of pre-conscious and post-conscious competitor is when you're a pre-conscious competitor, you're kind of just out there doing the thing. You're not self-conscious and you're not sort of present to the existential absurdity of what you're doing. So to kind of unpack that a little bit more, the way I kind of explain pre-conscious competitor is, so when I was much younger, I was like 5 or 6. Uh, my parents actually had me playing golf, and this was the early '90s, and more often than not, I would be the only kid at the driving range or the only kid out on the links, and it was unusual for children to be playing golf at that time. I had a set of really old clubs that had been cut down to fit me. And it was super simple for me. I would just kind of go out and whack the shit out of the ball. And I got a lot of satisfaction out of whacking the shit out of the ball, or whacking the ball a bit slightly and putting and getting the ball in the hole. And that was all that mattered to me. And I remember one time we were staying in the Outer Banks of North Carolina and we were playing Nags Head Links, and the pro actually went out and played with my father and I, and just because he thought I had potential and he was coaching me a little bit. And, you know, that was probably like the high watermark of my athletic career. A professional athlete thought I had potential. And I just loved golf. I just loved the simplicity of see ball, hit ball. And I loved the solitude of it. You know, I played a lot of team sports, and I love team sports too, but there was something very meditative about golf that attracted me at a very young age. But then my parents had some financial hardship and there was just no money for me to play golf. So I probably didn't play for like 3 or 4 years. And I came back to it as an extremely self-conscious preteen. And the simplicity of the act of just like hitting the ball and seeing where it went, the simplicity, the playful nature of it had gone because I'd become a conscious competitor. You know, all of a sudden I was self-aware, and we can scale that up into adulthood, like the conscious competitor as an adult, using examples from my personal life. You realize kind of the existential absurdity of what you're doing. Like there's an absurd nature to the fact that I'm a 36-year-old professional with a wife and a kid, and I'm putting all this time and effort and energy into preparing for this competition and money. Like I was thinking about, it would be interesting to do the math, what each minute on the mat will cost me in Las Vegas in terms of the price of food, the price of shelter, the price of transportation. And I thought it'd be like a great teacher, like a great t-shirt. I don't know if you guys have done IBJJF events. You always get the consolation t-shirt. I would love to just have one that's like, I went to Masters Worlds and all I got was this t-shirt. I bet if I scraped a few of those together and sold them in the parking lot, I could offset the cost of my lodging and transportation. So there's that absurdity, and there's also just like the existential absurdity. Like we're talking about like Camus type stuff. Like what is the point of this striving? What am I doing here? And of course I have a lot of thoughts about that. And then there's like the quite literal existential absurdity of like, what if I get hurt? You know, I was, my wife follows somebody on Instagram. I think he's like the husband of the wife behind like the Whole30 or something like that. And he competes, and apparently he injured himself pretty badly in his training camp, and now he's not going to be able to compete. And, you know, he had a pretty scary neck injury. And that's the kind of thing where like that shit can just happen. You know, this is a scary sport and that shit can just happen. So how do you go from that pre-conscious kid who just sees the ball, hits it, and has a great time doing it, to being extremely self-conscious, to being post-conscious? That's something that Emily talked about in this essay, and I don't want to kind of put it into language for her. I'll just share it with you and you could read it if that speaks to you. But I think that that's a journey that every competitor has to go through, and it's something that I think we all need to figure out for ourselves in terms of how we put the principles together. But I think one of the key principles is this idea of presence that I'm playing with. And it comes up in this week's meditation big time, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, before I do that, I just want to say this week's meditation, and I think all the meditations going forward, we'll see what her appetite is. The artwork that you see on the episode tile and on Instagram has been created by Elizabeth Bass, who is someone I met via Instagram, a fan of the podcast. And she is creating this artwork based on the little meditative essays that I write. And Really looking forward to collaborating with Elizabeth further and seeing what she creates. She has one of the best taglines on her Instagram profile that I've ever seen, and it's "This is my house. Take your shoes off." I think we could all sort of do well with that energy, a little bit more of that energy in our life. But if you want to check out her Instagram profile, and I strongly suggest you do, her handle is Liz Ka Learns. That's LizKaLearns, and the link to that will also be in the show notes. So, with that little preamble out of the way, let's get into this week's meditation. It's called Walking Through Fire. What does it feel like to walk through fire and come out unscathed? The hard path stretches before us, each jagged stone awaiting its bare foot. What does it feel like to walk this path unflinchingly? How do you feel each wound without thinking, without rationalizing it? Because here in the arena, there is no room for thought. Consider the jagged stone underfoot, and it only slices deeper. Every rationalization is a shadow that washes over you. Every thought is another shovel full of dirt on your grave. You see, the choice is easy. Come in from the dark. Walk through the fire. Yeah, I have notes here that for things I want to talk about, but I'm just going to ignore them like I usually do. The notes are kind of just like an emergency tether to pull me back to earth, I guess, if I need them. I want to start with that idea of coming in from the dark and walk through the fire. Coming in through the dark from the dark is an idea that comes up a lot in my writing. The most recent example comes to mind was something I wrote very early in my son's life when, I would go out. There's a wildlife management area like not 10 minutes from my house where I do a lot of my bow hunting. And I would be up in the tree in the pre-dawn, sitting there in the dark, thinking about my son and thinking about my wife and thinking about our lives. And I could always kind of feel when he would be waking up. He continues to wake up at a pretty consistent time, but it didn't matter where my attention was, what I was sort of scanning in the woods, but I would have this sense that my son was waking up and that my son was kind of calling me in from the dark. And when I look at my son, when he looks at me, it's as if he's kind of like taking my hand and pulling me back to the present. I've always felt that connection with him, like from the moment he was born. So I feel like so much of this idea of walking through fire is about that gentle hand kind of guiding you back to the present, away from this hyper-rational, hyper-critical mode of thinking. This is something that I've struggled with for a long time in my jiu-jitsu and my life in general. When I'm at my best, I'm like that little kid who kind of just sees the golf ball and hits it and just experiences the pure pleasure of movement and motion and doesn't really think about it that much. Now, I was reflecting a bit upon this on my drive home last night too. I'm struggling to integrate one particular sweep that I would love to have in my arsenal, and there's a technical gap, but I'm definitely more of, I want to say like an emotive and tactile type of learner. It's almost like I can't rationalize conviction in a movement until I feel it work. And so much of it is just creating the right circumstances to feel it work. And then I can think about it critically. And that requires a tremendous amount of presence, and presence requires a tremendous amount of training, thematic training, whether that's like something as simple as meditation or something as more complex or involved as cold plunging, bringing your mind and your body to bear on the present moment and to not push that beach ball back under the water. That's a lot of work. So to me, all that external stimuli is the fire. The fire is not just the opponent and what the opponent might do to you. It's that internal adversary too that I've talked about on a previous episode. And that internal adversary produces a lot of mental chatter, a lot of churn, a lot of emotional experiences. All of that is real, and all of that can burn you just as thoroughly as fire can burn you, and it has burned me in the past. And I guess that begs the question then of like, what are the stones that await our feet? We navigate in any chosen direction, and we're going to use an analogy of a fight. We're not dealing with a game of complete information in jiu-jitsu, right? I have no idea what my opponent is going to do. I can guess based on their previous competitive experience based on footage, if they have footage online of them. I can do all these things, but they might choose to go in a completely different direction entirely. And if I'm just rationalizing or thinking about all the various machinations and permutations of things that might happen, I'm not actually attuned to the moment. I'm not actually attuned to the stones that are under my feet. And those stones can be really painful and they can cut deeply, just as like falling into somebody's extremely tight triangle has consequences, or overextending your arm and getting it armbarred has consequences. When we take our mind off the present, off the potential, or off the very real pain of those experiences, we kind of had this tendency of making things worse. And in my mind, sort of those are the stones that await us on this journey, that await me on my journey into the arena. And all of this, all of these words, all of this churn that I'm verbalizing for you right now, it's kind of, I'm saying this because I think it might be constructive. I mean, that's always why I do these podcasts, is because if I'm feeling and thinking these things, chances are somebody else is too. And vocalizing them might be useful to you, to whoever is listening to this. But really, all of these words are just putting space and distance between me and the act of competing. They're putting layers between me and the direct experience. They're putting layers between you and the direct experience. Ultimately, we just need to simply feel and navigate without thinking. But we're so overly conditioned to think. We're so overly conditioned to rationalize. I mean, that's how most of us make our living. That's how we have survived and evolved as a species, because we have this very powerful forebrain, but that forebrain is only going to take you so far in competition. I think it takes you a very long way in training, refining your feedback loops, but when the moment comes, that sucker just kind of gets in the way. So, and that's kind of in my mind what the shovel is, pouring dirt on the grave, especially in the conscious competitor's mind. The conscious competitor knows that this thinking, this constant churn, is just kind of digging the hole that you can fall into. So how do we avoid this? How do we bring more presence into the fight? That's kind of what I see Masters Worlds as for me. It's this grand experiment of how do I do this with greater clarity, with more presence? And then kind of the last thing I want to mention about this meditation is something that Liz brought up in a conversation we were having. Let's focus in on that first sentence, or that first question. What does it feel like to walk through fire and come out unscathed? She said, well, do any of us come out unscathed? And, no. It brings to mind, I forget the name of the Doors song, but, it's the first line of the song is 5-1, babe, 1 in 5. No one here gets out alive. And fitting for Mr. Jim Morrison. But yeah, no one's getting out alive. Whether you win the match, whether you lose the match, whether you achieve your goals, whether you don't, in any arena in life, like we're all kind of going to the same place. And the experience of living takes a toll. Like we're all going to experience trauma. We're all going to experience hardship. Trauma can be as something as local to jiu-jitsu as an injury from a competition. Like, God knows I'm banged up right now. Or it could be something as really painful and sometimes debilitating as like suffering childhood abuse, like I did. And in the moment, I found when we're facing these hardships, especially the ones that are so staggering that they're hard to talk about, you can really feel the power of the more ancient systems of our brain, because you come out of the other side of it, if you're fortunate enough to come out of the other side of it, and you do feel, at least briefly, unscathed. But then that thinking brain comes in and you really begin to realize the extent of the damage. So, to Liz's point, I don't think that we come out unscathed. And I think that ultimately the extent of the damage becomes apparent to us when we enter that phase of integration. And, regardless, if everything goes perfectly for me, next week, there is going to be an integration period. There's going to be some damage to undo. There's going to be some pain to process. And that's just part of the journey. all of these things represent that beach ball, right? That we're just trying to push underwater. And every time we try and push it underwater, it just kind of creates more waves. So let's just be present to the beach ball this week, folks. Let's see where that gets us. That's about all I've got for you this week. As always, you can read and support BJJ Meditations on Mirror. The link for that will be in the show notes. If you don't want to do that, the other best way to support is to just like, subscribe, review, and share on whatever platform you're listening or watching, YouTube or any of the seemingly thousands of podcasting platforms that are available to you out in the world. For the latest and greatest updates on BJJ Meditations, you can follow us on Instagram. It's BJJ_meditations. Also encourage you to follow Elizabeth Bass. She is LIZKALEARNS on Instagram. Also will be in the show notes. And as always, BJJ Meditations is a free information resource for you. And this is all stuff that I've thought about, that has come up in my work, that I've sort of amalgamated from my life experience and my professional experience. But these are just ideas. We really need to put them in, integrate them into our lives in a systemic fashion. And I think that's kind of where I excel as a coach. So if you want to support BJJ Meditations, really the best way to do it is to book a session with me, which you can email me and we can talk about what that looks like. And of course, you can read my other work on Substack. That's joehannon.substack.com. And finally, come train at Princeton Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. If you find yourself in New Jersey, we'd love to see you. We welcome all academies, all affiliations, everyone. Come train with any of our amazing instructors, including Emily Kwok or Shane McCarthy or myself. We'd love to see you. But thanks everybody for listening. I'll have some competition updates for you next week. I might be recording it later in the week because I fly back on Saturday, but either way, I'll let you know how it goes. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support, and talk soon.